Episode 30, Chapter 28. Chapter 28.
Cass, have you ever heard the name Arn?
Cass looked at Link. The sun shone overhead, providing a bright, warm day. It was windier than either of them would like, but at least visibility was good. They both sat on a field of lush grass, surrounded by nothing but rolling hills. The nearest bokoblin encampment was at least a mile away, and Cass had seen nothing larger than a fox moving in their general area.
Arn? I cannot say that I have, Link. Is it someone that I should know?
Link pulled up a blade of grass, running his calloused thumb along its length. He didn't reply for several seconds. Finally, he said,
I think it's my father's name.
He closed his eyes tightly, trying to force his mind to focus. To remember. They had been walking, skulking, really, past a group of moblins that were fighting over the desiccated corpse of a deer, when the name had occurred to Link. He hadn't been thinking about his family or really anything except avoiding another fight, yet the name had surfaced in his mind, like a piece of driftwood bobbing up from the depths of the sea. Just the name, at first. Link hadn't even reacted, he just kept walking while holding tightly to Spirit's reins. After they had gotten past the moblins, which had well and truly begun to fight each other, he turned the name over in his head. It was a familiar name, yet he could recall no face. No personality. No memories. But as he considered it more and more, he was able to identify certain feelings that arose within him as he considered it. A name that he respected and looked up to. A name that he aspired to be worthy of. A father's name. Remember, Link, he told himself, gripping the little blade of grass in his hand. He heard Cass' voice but ignored it. So close. So close. A smiling man with a bushy mustache, long blonde hair, and thick arms. His expression was warm. Proud. Link had just bested a knight. True, the knight had probably been toying with the child, who was only 4 at the time, but that wasn't how Link saw it. And by his father's expression, it wasn't how he saw it, either. All either of them had seen was the way the boy Link had deflected the knight's sword, a thin stick, and then struck him on the wrist to force him to drop it. Link had disarmed his opponent on the field of battle, and every soldier knew that such an act was a victory. Link gasped as if coming up for air. He grasped at the memory, replaying it in his head, trying to memorize every detail. The man's smile, his laugh, the way he had reached out with his enormous hand and tousled Link's hair. Arn. His father.
Link.
He shook his head, struggling to find the words to describe what he felt. His father. He had seen his father. Like an open floodgate, other memories began to pour in. Riding in the saddle with his father across the bridge to Zora's domain, seeing him standing guard at a door in a navy blue uniform with golden accents, sparring against him with practice swords within the castle grounds, wrestling on the ground with him in Hyrule Field. It was all too much. Link reached up with a shaking hand, touching his cheek and feeling the wetness there. He sniffed and rubbed at his eyes with the back of his hand, clearing his throat.
Sorry, he said, voice thick with emotion. I hadn't expected.
Cass looked at him with concern but chose not to speak. Link took a few moments to compose himself before, finally, clearing his throat again and standing.
We should keep moving. Those bokoblins from earlier had horses, and they might still be looking for us.
As Cass rose, he walked over to where Spirit stood, reaching up and scratching the horse's nose. Spirit nickered affectionately, and Link reached down, pulling a sugar cube from his pack, a treat that he had discovered Spirit had a great fondness for after spending so long at the Death Mountain trading outpost. Link had retrieved Spirit several days prior, utilizing his upgraded Sheikah slate to transport to the Death Mountain Tower and then used it to depart the base of the mountain once he was out of sight of the outpost. He never saw the awaiting Yiga, and they would never see him. The next few days had been spent preparing for the trip across country. During his preparations, Link had sent Cass to the Zora, allowing him to use the Sheikah slate for quicker transportation, to discuss the increasing monster situation in the Necluda region. The results had not been as conclusive as Link had hoped. Though Sidon had agreed readily, King Dorifan had not been so willing to send his soldiers so far outside of their home without further consideration. Sidon promised to speak with his father further, even going so far as to suggest that he might just take a squad and do it himself, if Dorifan refused. It was something, at least. The Gorons had been more helpful when Link traveled back to Goron City, but only just. Bluto, like Dorifan, was hesitant about the amount of support he was willing to give up. He agreed to send some Gorons to help with the building of defenses, but only after he dealt with a large population of wild Dodongos that had been uncovered in the northern mine. It appeared that Death Mountain's seismic activity had caused rapid change to the mine, caving in old tunnels and opening others, including some where the large, fire-breathing lizards inhabited. Even Impa had been uncertain of the number of Sheikah that she could send to Haydono's aid, though she did promise support. It was a busy time for the agricultural community, and Kakariko did not have nearly as many warriors as it once had. It would have to do. When he departed Kakariko village, he did so under the guise of intending on turning south once out on the road, riding towards the Gerudo Desert. Cass had not been with him lest anyone suspect him of the duplicity, choosing instead to join him at the wetland stable, where they had first met. If Kakariko village did house a Yiga spy, Link hoped that they were fooled. Crossing Hyrule Field in the open would be a difficult task. Even crossing the river Hylia would be a challenge, for though there were still a handful of standing bridges, all led into areas watched by bands of monsters or were just too close to the castle and, therefore, at risk of being targeted by its legion of automatons. Once they made over the bridges, there would be other creatures, both large and small, that made the central region of Hyrule, with its lakes, plains, forests, and old towns, their home. Some would choose to run and hide, but others would surely attack them on sight. Ultimately, they had opted on crossing the bridge nearest the stable. It was closer to the castle than Cass thought safe, but would hopefully enable them to avoid crossing paths with a particularly large and dangerous band of monsters that made their home to the south, in the middle of a swamp. They had been mostly right. Departing the stable before dawn, Link made his way alone to the bridge in question while Cass flew ahead to scout out the area. He had eventually rejoined Link at the bridge, telling him of a group of bokoblins that had made camp just south of the road in a wooded patch. They attempted to cross without incident, but a sentry spotted them, sounding the alarm. What followed was a brief fight, followed by a tense escape. 2 bokoblins had come for them on horseback, which Link had shot down with a pair of arrows. The other bokoblins had hesitated at that, and Link thought that they would be able to continue without further incident. Then about a dozen more bokoblins had burst from the trees, wielding all sorts of primitive weapons. Link and Cass chose not to find out if they could take such a large group and ran. The bokoblins hadn't given chase for long, as far as they could tell. Link quickly found out why most people did not travel through Hyrule Field. Monsters were far more common on this side of the river than the other, and they seemed that much more aggressive as well. They were at odds with the beauty of the land. The grass and the rolling hills seemed, at times, untouched and pristine, but then they would come across the remains of an old building, a fence, or a cart, and would be reminded of the life that once inhabited this land. A road, overgrown from misuse, led on a winding path through the field, but they quickly left it, cutting across the hills and through groves of trees in an attempt to avoid detection. Cass often took flight, flying around in wide circles, keeping an eye out for any trouble that they needed to avoid, such as the fighting moblins. Their path was a slow one. The need for stealth greatly outweighed the need for speed in this case, and Link often spent a great deal of time dismounted, leading Spirit by the reins. He had begun to think it would have been easier to leave Spirit in Hateno village and return later to retrieve him, assuming that Link would find another Sheikah shrine near Rito village, as he had the other major population centers, but it was too late for that now. Only after passing by another roving band of bokoblins did Cass finally land on the ground beside Link again with a large flap of his wings, which sent a burst of air out in all directions. He looked at Link and nodded.
"We're past them. They didn't see either of us."
Link exhaled slowly and stood up a little straighter. That hadn't been a particularly dangerous-looking group. He felt confident that he could have won in a fight, but it would have been too out in the open, too visible to other groups in the area. And it would have made it easier to track their progress. They couldn't risk the attention, if they could avoid it. Not as long as they were in the monster's domain.
"They patrol this area a lot,"
Link said, reaching into his pack and offering an apple to Spirit.
"The Bens are very territorial here,"
Cass said, reaching up to stroke the feathers under his beak.
"But I believe they are also keeping an eye out for rogue guardians. I have seen some in my travels over the field. Some do seem to wander this far south."
It sent a chill down Link's spine. They had discussed the guardians, of course, agreeing that the best option would be to try to walk the line between monster territory and guardian territory. There were fewer large groups here. But the risk of coming across one of the 6-legged automatons was higher, as well. Link reached down to down the quiver that held his ancient arrows. He had 3 remaining. Would one stop a guardian, as it had the blight in Rudania? Maybe. Robbie hadn't been sure if a single arrow would do the trick. Link hoped it would, if the need arose.
There aren't any around here, right?
Link said, finally looking back up at Cass, who shook his head.
Not at all that I have seen. Good.
Link forced himself to relax. If any of the guardians had been walking near here, Cass would have seen it. They began walking again, angling slightly more south to walk parallel to the road, cutting through a wooded area to remain unseen.
Link,
Cass said after a few minutes of silence. Link looked up at him.
Would you like to speak about what you saw earlier? Your father.
He looked down, frowning.
I'm not sure what there is to say. I still don't really know anything about him, I saw him. He was a guard.
Link paused and then shook his head. That wasn't right.
No, he was a knight in the Royal Guard. Ah.
Cass said, nodding.
An illustrious position, then. My teacher spoke of them in some of his lessons of courtly life. The Royal Guard was reserved for those that the king trusted most highly. They were not only expected to protect the royal family with their lives but were also exposed to all of the court intrigue, deception, and politicking that common folk and even other nobles never had the opportunity to see. They were secret bearers and confidants.
The memories of Daruk surfaced in his mind again. Princess Zelda had certainly not felt that way towards him. Not at the beginning. It was petty, perhaps, to think of such things now, but the hurt that he had felt in those memories was real. He had been scared. She had been too, he supposed.
What of your mother?
Cass said, drawing Link back out of his thoughts.
I don't know.
Link shrugged.
I can't remember anything about her. I hadn't even remembered anything about my father until today.
Cass considered him for a time before speaking again.
I am certain that the memories will come. It seems to me that you are able to answer many more questions now of your past life than you were able to do so in Zora's domain. I remember a handful of events and some minor details. I still don't remember anything about how I grew up, what my relationship to my parents were like, who my friends, besides Mipha and Daruk, were. Sometimes,
Link sighed, looking away. He was talking too much.
I feel like a stranger in my own body.
Cass remained silent, listening. Waiting. Link continued.
It's not just the big details, but it's the little ones too. So far, I know that I'm good with a sword. What other skills do I have? What about my hobbies? There must have been more to me than the Master Sword. Have the Elder Sheikah been unwilling to share these details with you? Well, no.
Link looked down, frowning.
But I haven't asked them. It feels like something that I should know myself. I don't want to know facts about who I used to be. You wish to be that person?
Link looked back up at Cass and, after a moment, nodded.
Yeah.
Cass smiled at him, chuckling softly.
I feel confident enough in my knowledge of history to say that you still are the same man now that you were then. I do not know those particular details, of course, but your personality and drive match the man that my teacher spoke of. Were we friends? Your teacher and I? I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. I think you told me.
Cass chuckled again.
Rao. My teacher's name was Rao. And no, actually. I do not believe you were friends. In fact, I rather think that my teacher did not particularly like you. What?
Link stopped walking, frowning.
Why? I suppose I am being somewhat facetious. I do not believe that my teacher would have considered you a friend when he knew you. However, in the years that followed your fall, he appears to have developed a great respect for you. His songs certainly reflect as much. Did he say why he didn't like me? Did I do something to harm or offend him?
Cass' teacher was a court bard, right? Was Link somehow rude to the bard? Was he some kind of bully?
Oh, no, not at all. My teacher was simply jealous. Jealous? Of what? The Master Sword.
From what Link knew of his feelings holding the sword, he thought that he probably would have gladly given the responsibility for it up to anyone else who wished for it.
Of the princess,
Cass said, his smile growing.
Or, I should say, of the time that you got to spend with her. He didn't like me because I was around the princess. Oh, yes. You see, he was very fond of Princess Zelda. He loved her, but she...
Cass hesitated, suddenly looking slightly abashed.
She was almost never without her knight.
It sent a chill down Link's spine. Almost never without her knight. He thought of the spring of power. He thought of the familiarity with which they had spoken to each other then and in other moments that he had had a chance to glimpse. But he also thought of the memories he had had with Daruk. She had not cared for him, had she? When had it changed? What changed it? The conversation tapered off. Each of them seemed unsure on how to break the silence that followed, both of them holding on to words that were difficult to speak aloud.
Whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight, the sacred blade is forever bound to the soul of the hero. We pray for your protection, and we hope that the two of you will grow stronger together, as one.
Link pursed his lips. She had spoken the words like a dead woman, cold and emotionless. Her eyes held nothing for him as she reached her gloved hand out to him, as if to anoint him with holy powers that she did not yet possess. They had all gathered on the sacred ground to the south of Castle Town, the place that legends held Calamity Ganon was defeated 10,000 years prior, Princess Zelda and her champions. Link had knelt before her, as was befitting his status as a Hyrulean knight, and listened silently as she spoke the rites. It had been a painful experience for him, for her, and by the muttering he heard from the champions, for them as well. At least it was over. The champions had all departed to return to their homes, Princess Zelda had gone back to doing whatever it was in her free time, and he had returned to? What? Being the hero with the sacred blade, he supposed. What, exactly, was there even for him to do? He was a knight, knighted only a short time after pulling the blade, yet he was given nothing to do as a knight. He had been given no land of his own beyond the land that his family was already responsible for, nor had he been put in charge over any other soldiers or keeps. He hadn't even been given a page, as was to be expected when knighted. So, he had come to the castle grounds, intent on enjoying the beautiful day while he could. Rain was expected later. He could already see the clouds developing to the west, over the Dabantha frontier. It would be upon them within a couple of hours. When he stepped outside, however, he found that a small crowd had already gathered outside, forming a semicircle around something that Link couldn't see from his vantage. He approached the back of the crowd. As he did so, several of the people lined up, glanced back at him and quickly parted, eyes wide. He could hear their mutters as he passed through the crowd, the people parting around him and reforming after he had passed. Hero, they called him. Chosen. He never knew how much one could grow to hate simple words. Once he reached the front of the crowd, he discovered what the crowd was there to see. The Sheikah had brought out one of their strange devices, the Guardians. This one sat inert on a cart, its long legs wrapped around its base, making it look like it had been settled onto a nest of some grey-white material. Its cylindrical head moved though, the strange Sheikah designs upon it glowing with a soft orange light. The blue eye in the center of its head pulsed blue. Legends held that these things were instrumental against Calamity Ganon 10,000 years ago. Thus far, Link wasn't really sure how useful they could be. So far, he had never actually seen one of them in motion, outside of simple head movements. They held no weapons that he could see. Their long legs ended in dangerous-looking three-clawed feet, but were those the only weapons that they possessed?
Your Majesty,
said the Sheikah in front of the cart. With a start, Link realized that he had emerged from the crowd only a few feet away from where King Roam and Princess Zelda both stood, each resplendent in their royal robes. The king glanced towards Link, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement, but Princess Zelda paid him no heed, instead staring with wide eyes at the Guardian.
As you know, Guardians were used to defend the incarnation of the goddess and the hero against the calamity 10,000 years ago, but we were unable to determine what functions they used to accomplish this task. Until now.
The Sheikah spoke with the air of a street performer. Though he stood with his feet firmly planted on grass, he could have been standing atop a box or a bench, gesturing to the passing crowd. Link noticed that he had a curved sword belted to his waist and frowned. The Sheikah was familiar to him. He had seen him before speaking with Princess Zelda, often accompanied by the other, shorter Sheikah woman named Pura.
You see, after weeks of dedicated study and experimentation, we have made a breakthrough in Guardian technology. We have discovered the weapons used by the Guardians to subdue the calamity 10,000 years ago, and which will be used to defeat it when it dares to rise again.
Link glanced over towards King Roam and Princess Zelda. The king looked calm, but a little impatient. His lips formed a straight line, and Link thought that the Sheikah man was rather well composed, considering the king's intense stare. Princess Zelda, on the other hand, looked rapturous. She looked at the guardian with a broad smile upon her face and a posture that suggested that she was doing everything in her power to remain rooted to the spot, rather than running to get a closer look.
Your Majesty, with your permission.
The king nodded, and the Sheikah spun on his heels, snapping his fingers at a few other Sheikah members that had climbed into the cart with the guardian. They began fiddling with some kind of controls that Link couldn't see. Suddenly, the guardian shuddered, its twisted legs twitching in the cart. The Sheikah attendants stepped back, careful not to trip.
Now,
the Sheikah man said. Robbie. That was his name, Link suddenly remembered. He had been with pure awe during the champion ceremony. Robbie bent down and picked up a disc-like object from the ground at his feet. It took Link a moment to realize what it was, a wooden pot lid of the likes used in the kitchens. Robbie held the disc in his hand, smiling proudly at King Roam and the princess, and then whirled, throwing the disc into the air behind the guardian. The pot lid spun through the air, arcing slightly. The guardian's head twisted around, its blue eye tracking the pot lid's progress through the air. Suddenly, from the eye, there was a brilliant flash of blue-white light and a sound like a thunderclap. A beam of some kind of energy shot out from the eye and struck the pot lid with a fiery explosion. A moment later, as the smoke cleared, Link saw the smoldering remains of the pot lid, now broken into multiple pieces, falling to the grounds below. For a moment, there was a hush over the crowd. King Roam's eyes were wide. Princess Zelda had covered her mouth with her hands. And then the crowd began to speak excitedly and clap. The princess joined their clapping, grinning. Link saw Robbie tip her a quick wink before clasping his hands in front of him and bowing low. As the crowd's initial reaction faded, Robbie raised his hands for silence before looking again at the king.
Another demonstration, Your Majesty.
King Roam reached up and stroked his long beard thoughtfully.
Yes, go ahead.
Robbie picked up another pot lid, holding it in his hand. The guardian's head lazily turned until the eye fell on the pot lid that he held in the air. Link saw its eye flash as it found its target. The Sheikah threw the pot lid into the air again, but the lid had barely left his hand before the guardian fired. The pot lid exploded with a loud crack, sending burning pieces of it flying over the heads of the crowd. Some people screamed, and others ducked, covering their heads with their hands. Robbie, for his part, immediately raised his hands, calling for calm.
I just took too long to throw it. Everything is fine. Everything. Robbie.
Princess Zelda's voice. Robbie glanced at her and then whirled just in time to watch with horror as the guardian, with its eye now focused on the small pile of pot lids by Robbie's feet, fired again. Link was far enough from the explosion that the shock wave only caused him to stumble, but he saw Robbie flung through the air, trailed by lines of smoke. The crowd surged backwards now, screaming and running as fast as they could. They had already begun to trample over each other in an effort to escape back into the castle. The Sheikah attendants atop the cart were working to stop the guardian now, yet nothing they were doing seemed to be making any difference. The pot lids that the guardian had targeted had been scattered across the grounds, and the guardian's eye seemed to be seeking each of them out. It fired again at one that had ended up leaning against a tree. The blast cracked the tree trunk in half, sending it toppling to the side.
Zelda.
Link turned and saw that King Roam had stumbled in an effort to keep hold of Princess Zelda's arm. She had broken free of him and had run to help Robbie, who lay face down in the grass some 10 feet away. Somehow, a pot lid had ended up half underneath his prone form. No. Link's eyes widened, and he glanced back at the guardian, which seemed to notice the same thing he had. He broke into a run, scooping up one of the other fallen pot lids as he went. He crossed the distance between him and the princess in what felt like an eternity. To his horror, he saw the guardian's eye flash as it prepared to fire on the princess of Hyrule and the incarnation of the goddess. Link yelled, gripping the pot lid by its handle, and thrust himself between the firing guardian and the princess. The guardian fired. Time slowed. Link swung. The blast struck Link's pot lid in its center, but it did not explode, as the others had. Instead, as Link swung his right arm out, as if to deflect a sword attack with a shield, he felt the lid connect with something that felt far more solid than he had expected. The beam of energy turned in on itself, redirected back in the direction of the guardian's pulsing blue eye. It struck with the same powerful explosion that sent the two Sheikah attendants diving off of the cart for cover. When the smoke cleared, the guardian still stood, but it trembled violently in its enclosure. The orange lights on its body flickered rapidly. And suddenly, with a blinding white light and the sound of a powerful explosion, the automaton exploded, sending pieces of its body flying in all directions. Link ducked his head behind his impromptu shield as chunks of the guardian struck the ground and even the walls of the castle. None hit him or his shield, however, and soon silence fell over the courtyard. Breathing heavily, he looked around towards the princess and was surprised to see that she had flung herself down over the Sheikah scientist's prone form, seemingly shielding him with her body. Slowly, she looked up, appearing to be every bit as breathless as he felt. Their eyes met, green on blue. Her eyes widened.
Zelda.
The king was suddenly at her side, helping her to her feet.
Are you all right? Were you harmed? I'm all right. Nothing. Oh, no.
She pulled away from King Roam's grip again, stepping up beside Link to stare in horror at the smoking remains of the guardian, which mostly just consisted of the circular base upon which its head normally rested, and its legs, which were strung out in all directions. The cart had collapsed, its wheel snapping under the force of the explosion. She turned back to Link, expression showing anger.
You destroyed it. Zelda.
Her father's voice was stern as he walked up beside her. Her eyes flicked to the king's, and then quickly fell to the floor.
Of course, I was not myself. I apologize.
She did not look at Link, however, but at Robbie, who chose that moment to groan and slowly lift his head from the ground. Over the course of the next few minutes, Robbie and the remainder of the crowd were seen to by medical staff within the castle. Miraculously, the Sheikah man was the only one who suffered any injuries beyond minor scrapes and bruises, and his injuries were not serious. He was taken to be seen by the castle surgeons, however, to ensure no bones were broken. Before he walked away, supported by a nurse under one arm, he pled forgiveness from King Roam, who grunted and waved him away. Link stood rooted to the same spot that he had been when he deflected the guardian's attack. The grass in front of him had been scorched black in a line leading back to the broken cart. Heavy footfalls behind him finally forced Link to turn, looking up as King Roam approached behind him. He quickly knelt, bowing his head.
Rise, Sir Link.
Link did so, standing back to his feet. He noticed that Princess Zelda stood just behind and to the right of the king, eyes on the guardian wreckage.
I must thank you for saving my daughter's life. If you had not reacted in the way that you had, then she...
He glanced down towards the princess, who seemed much smaller now, standing in her father's shadow.
I do wonder how it was that you knew that you could block that attack with that lid, however.
Link glanced down. He still held the pot lid in his hand. Charred wood covered its underside, where the guardian's blast had struck it. He glanced back up at the king, opening his mouth to speak. Words did not immediately come, however his mouth felt suddenly parched. Link licked his lips before trying again.
I didn't, Your Majesty. I just... acted.
The look on King Roam's face indicated that this was the right thing for Link to say. His lips curled into a smile.
Yes, I can see that. It is abundantly clear to me that the Master Sword has not chosen poorly.
The sword on Link's back suddenly seemed that much heavier.
As you likely well know, I have been searching for some time for a knight suitable to be Princess Zelda's personal knight.
Princess Zelda's head snapped up as he spoke, eyes widening with a look of horror. She stepped up beside the king.
Father, no. Zelda.
King Roam's voice cracked like a whip, and she ducked her head, cowed by the sharpness of his tone. Link glanced towards her briefly and then back at the king, trying to keep his expression carefully neutral. King Roam looked back at Link, expression stern.
As I was saying, I have been searching for some time for a personal knight to guard my daughter on her travels to oversee the work done on the divine beasts, as well as her journey to attain the blessing of the goddess Hylia.
Link felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach.
After seeing how you protected her life today, with no thought of your own safety, I feel that I have been looking in the wrong places.
The king regarded Link quietly for a long moment before glancing around at the crowd that was still gathered nearby. He grunted and then looked back at Link.
Sir Link, I would discuss this with you further, but not here. Please, join me at my table for the evening meal. We shall hold our discussion at that time. Yes, Your Majesty.
Calm. Stay calm. Do not let your emotions show. Not in front of the king. His eyes briefly flicked towards Princess Zelda, who met his eyes with a cold, emotionless expression. The sinking feeling in the pit of Link's stomach only grew more insistent.
Good.
King Roam reached out, placing a heavy hand on Link's shoulder, squeezing.
I will see you then, my boy.
He turned, beginning back towards the castle. For a moment, Princess Zelda remained firmly in place, still looking at Link. He glanced at her and found that her eyes were not on his face, however, but she was looking at a spot just over his left shoulder. At the hilt of the Master's sword.
Zelda. Come.
King Roam had stopped a few feet and looked back towards his daughter, expression stern. Link saw her shoulders slump slightly, and she turned, following in the king's wake. He watched them depart, trying hard to keep his feet steady beneath him. Princess Zelda's personal knight? It sounded like the worst possible position that the king could have put him in. And, from her own reaction, she felt the same way. Head bowing in resignation, Link dropped the pot lid to the grass and began walking towards the entrance to the castle, intending on finding something nicer to wear for dinner with the royal family. Along the way, he could hear the whispers of the few people that still remained in the courtyard. Hero, they called him. Chosen. Link had the memory as he slept. Far clearer than any dream he ever had before. He could still the weight of the pot lid in his hand, the heat of the Guardian's blast on his skin, the warmth of the sun overhead. He could still hear every word as it replayed in his mind, over and over.
Father, no.
He sat up on his bedroll, facing towards the distant castle, which was lit by the ominous red light of Calamity Ganon's malice. Stars still filled the sky overhead, and the pale moon had not yet reached its zenith. Neither of them had opted to erect any sort of shelter, choosing to sleep under the stars. It would be quicker to tear down camp this way. They had no fire. The night was cool, but not cold, and a fire would have been a beacon to any nocturnal creatures that roamed the field. There was a flutter of feathers and a rush of air as Cass landed just outside of the circle of their small camp. He stood up straighter and turned, eyes opening wide when he saw Link sitting up.
Link.
Cass was on watch currently. Neither of them felt comfortable sleeping when so thoroughly surrounded by monsters on all sides, so they had agreed to sleep in shifts and get back on the road well before sunrise to take advantage of the cover of darkness while they could.
Hey, Cass. Is everything all right?
Link's eyes didn't meet his. Instead, he kept looking towards the castle, watching as the red haze lazily swirled around its broken towers. We became friends, right? We did. I saw that. His memories were becoming jumbled, though. Confused. How much time passed between them? He had no way of knowing. No reference point. How long were he and Princess Zelda forced to be near each other before some kind of friendship developed between them? Could it really be called a friendship, if it was forced? Yet, in that moment, all he felt was the dread. He didn't think that he had hated the princess. But her presence made him feel miserable in his memory. He didn't hate her, but she hated him. How could he feel any happiness in the presence of that? He hadn't wanted anything to do with the princess or her quest, yet.
Sometimes I wonder if I would be better off without the memories,
Link finally said, quietly. Cass settled down beside him on the grass, gazing towards the castle.
I take it that you experienced another memory. What happened in it, if I may ask? I saved the princess's life. And she hated me for it.
Grimacing at his own tone, Link shook his head.
Sorry. I think I just need some time to sort through my memories before I talk about them. Of course.
Cass reached out, laying a feathered hand on Link's shoulder.
Though, if I may offer one piece of advice. I am a storyteller, and I know that there is always more to a story than what is told. Context is a vital part of any story and can often make the difference between a good tale and a poor one. Link, if you still lack context, as I assume that you do by nature of your memory loss, I encourage you to refuse to accept your memories just as they are. You may still be missing key moments in your life that would better explain the things that you have seen.
Link nodded, appreciating the words and knowing the truth behind them, though he wasn't sure that they made him feel better. He still couldn't shake the words that Princess Zelda had spoken or the look of horror that showed on her face. What, exactly, had he done to make her hate him so?
Come.
Cass stood, stretching.
I assume that you are not going to be getting any more rest, and I have just completed my reconnaissance of the surrounding area. We have an open window right now and should be able to move more quickly for a time.
Link pushed himself to his feet, nodding again, but remaining silent. He helped Cass pack up their small camp, and together, they set off again into the night. End of chapter.